I believe we left off here at the end of last segment, talking about the vicious Battle of Stalingrad that many scholars believe was the turning point of the entire war, and you can make a good case for that. The grim human toll of this kind of mother of all battles in the war saw approximately 850,000 German soldiers killed, missing, or wounded, and about 1 million of their Soviet counterparts killed, missing, or wounded. Virtually the entire Russian population of the city perished in the weeks and months of intense fighting that happened here. One Russian officer, actually a fairly famous one, kept a diary, and one of his passages says, "Fumes, smoke, we could not breathe, shells and bombs bursting all around us, so much noise that however loud you shouted, no one could hear you. Many times the radio operator would be killed with the microphone in his hands." He was talking about his own, that was his own headquarters. He was a high-ranking officer too, and he's still subjected to this kind of brutality and closeness to death. By 1943, the Soviets were pushing back in their direction, counterattacking, and doing so successfully. The Battle of Kursk, which counts as the largest tank battle in history. Remember, we've seen already a number of, this was the biggest this and the biggest that. Here's another one. But in the center of the line, Central Front, you can see in the map there that the Russians sort of opened up what's called a salient, pushing that part of the German line back significantly, not just because of the Battle of Kursk, but that's sort of the main factor. In this battle, about 110,000 German casualties, 2,000 armored vehicles destroyed, mostly tanks, about 700 aircraft shot down. Soviet losses, 250,000 killed, missing or captured, 600,000 wounded or sick, 6,000 armored vehicles destroyed, 1,800 aircraft. This is a good example of something I said earlier in the lecture, and that is the German Wehrmacht was so good that even when they lost, they extracted far higher casualties usually than they took. This was true here. We see two, in many ways, great leaders facing off in this part of the war on the Eastern Front. The rising star, General Zhukov on the Soviet side, and the kind of former star, but one who falls, Erich von Manstein on the German side. Manstein had been, in many ways, the brains behind the invasion of France, Case White, or was it Case Yellow? I get them mixed up. I think it was Case Yellow. But he had been transferred to the Eastern Front, and the two guys here kind of went head to head. Reading from Andrew Roberts' book, which I've quoted before, he says, in the spring of 1944, Hitler dismissed Manstein, who in the mind of many military historians had the finest brain on the German or perhaps any side of the war. You can almost look at the Soviet-German war between 1942 and 44 as a duel between Manstein and Zhukov. Historian John Erickson states, it takes in Stalingrad, then Kursk, and it all comes to a head in early 1944 when Manstein and Zhukov again duel in eastern Ukraine. These are two striking, outstanding strategic thinkers, planners, and commanders of the first rank. Whereas Stalin had the sense to retain Zhukov, Hitler dismissed Manstein. Yet again, Hitler makes bad military decisions that end up costing he and Nazi Germany, in this case, dismissing quite possibly his most gifted general or field marshal. In the midst of all this, and I'm kind of backtracking here somewhat, the Allied strategic bombing campaign over Germany was ongoing over a number of years. This saw American and British planes taking off from England and flying over German cities, Hamburg, Dusseldorf, Cologne, eventually maybe the most famous one of all, the firebombing of Dresden. But many of these cities were hit again and again and again. So Germany and its civilian population did take heavy casualties here, as many as 600 plus thousand civilians killed due to bombing raids. Very heavy damage done to German industry. And there was somewhat of a debate between the Americans and the British. The British preferred to fly at night, when of course it was harder to shoot their bombers down for lack of visibility, because the German anti-aircraft fire was quite heavy. As you can see in the upper right, those flashes are flak from anti-aircraft shells. So being a bomber pilot or a member of a bomber crew was not really a recipe for a long life in World War II. These guys were among those that had the greatest chance of getting killed of any job you had in the war. The only other one I think that comes close, might even be a little bit ahead, would be if you were an American in the Navy, in submarines around Japan and Southeast Asia. That was also extremely dangerous. Not that the rest of the war wasn't, but the British preferred to fly at night over German cities and then do what became known as carpet bombing, which means you just drop bombs indiscriminately once you at least know you're over the city. But that means then you're going to not be able to hit specific targets. You're going to be blanketing the city, which then means killing civilians. We see from the number above that, that's a lot of what happened. But this was done deliberately over time as a way to try to break the morale and the backbone of the German support for the war effort. It didn't have that effect, as I think was predictable, but that was the intent. The Americans preferred, at least at first, they did a bit of both and kind of caved into the British will later on, but they had at first preferred precision bombing, which meant pick specific targets like factories and military facilities and hit them precisely, accurately. But that meant flying during the day, when it was far more dangerous because the anti-aircraft batteries and guns could train their sights on you far more easily for obvious reasons. The firebombing of Dresden maybe stands out as the most devastating of all Allied bombing raids over and onto a German city. You can see the statistics there for yourself. But the bombing was so intense that there was a kind of a spontaneous firestorm that destroyed over 1,600 acres on the ground in the center of the city. About 25,000 people were killed underneath one night's bombing raid. Hundreds of bombers, thousands of bombs being dropped on that one night. This did take its toll, if not on the morale of the German population, certainly on their industry, their ability to produce weapons. Though they did produce more planes, tanks, ships every year of the war than the previous year until 1945, which makes it look like the bombing raids then failed to successfully combat German industry. But what that leaves out, of course, is the possibility that had they not been bombing German cities so intensely, that the production numbers would have been much higher than that, which was, I think, certainly true. So the bombing did cut back how much the Germans could produce and otherwise would have. The joint operations between the United States and Great Britain are now legendary, and they were starting to open second fronts in the West. Stalin, once the big three, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States, were in a sense forced together as the big three allies. Forced because the one communist country in the world was not a natural ally for the two most powerful and wealthy liberal capitalist democracies in the world. The common denominator was Hitler. All of them were threatened by the massive unleashing of force that came from Germany, and so the only way they could defeat them, Nazi Germany, was to ally together. It does show you the intense military presence of Nazi Germany, that the two arguably most powerful countries in the world, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and then kind of the former number one in the world, Great Britain, that was still powerful enough. It took the combined might of all three of those countries to bring Germany down, and it took a number of years to do that. But Stalin, from the beginning of the Americans' kind of arrival in Europe, alongside of the Brits, insisted, demanded a second front be opened, and a bigger and bigger one at that. Of course, the reason is because without a major second front, before there was a major second front, Stalin was taking the brunt of the German Wehrmacht. They didn't have to split too many troops off and save them in the West, in occupied France, other places, because the Allies weren't attacking there, at least not yet. So this became a major point of contention within the Allied sort of leadership camp. The principal Americans involved in all this, other than Franklin Roosevelt, the president, of course, but the two big military men, George C. Marshall on the right, the Army Chief of Staff, basically the equivalent of today's chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They didn't have that position quite then, but he was the number one military figure in the country. And on the left, the guy that became more famous, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Marshall was Eisenhower's boss. Roosevelt believed that Marshall had such a brilliant career and done so much for the United States military and his country that he deserved to go to Europe and be the Supreme Allied Commander, but Roosevelt needed him at home. He couldn't do without him, he felt, and needed his advice day after day. So he gave Eisenhower that job, even though Marshall was still his boss. But what Roosevelt knew, and he was correct, was that if I give Eisenhower the job, he's the guy that's going to go down in history as the famous one, become the big war hero, and Americans are likely largely to forget George C. Marshall, and he doesn't deserve that. But in the end, Roosevelt did what he thought was best for the war effort in the country, not what was best for sort of Marshall's career. Though it was a glittering career anyway. But he was right. Most of you have probably heard of Dwight Eisenhower, and probably few of you have heard of George C. Marshall, which I think basically said at one point earlier in this class. But so who would get the glory? In the end, it would be Eisenhower. On the British side, America's allies in this fight, at least in the military, of course, the political leader was Winston Churchill. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill became close friends. Their relationship was sometimes tattered and torn, and they had their issues, but the friendship was actually pretty solid, which helped the alliance a great deal. They truly did like each other. Alan Brooke was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, kind of the equivalent of George Marshall's position. Bernard Montgomery was the leading senior ground commander in the British Army. He was actually under the leadership, as was Brooke, of Eisenhower. Once Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, Eisenhower's headquarters were in Great Britain. He had a staff of British and American generals under him. But with the United States, over time, providing more and more of the manpower, because it was a bigger country, more and more of the weapons and supplies, because it had a bigger economy, there was just no way that the British could insist that their guy be Supreme Allied Commander. So was Eisenhower basically commanding everyone else. Montgomery was a notoriously difficult general to handle, big ego, and Eisenhower had to deal with him and a number of others with the same issues. So the Anglo-American military relationship was quite a difficult one. General Marshall, General Brooke, again the major drivers behind strategy, alongside the two political leaders, but they had a fundamentally different view, reading here, quote, of how the war should be won, with Marshall arguing for an early cross-channel assault in force across the English Channel to occupied France and driving German forces out of there. That was the goal. But the British General Brooke, preferring to see German forces diverted and defeated piecemeal, like piece by piece, in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and actually other places before the clash in northwest France was even attempted. The meetings of the staffs saw the arguments for each option debated aggressively from 1942 to 1944, with stand-up yelling matches occasionally developing. So the much vaunted, talked about alliance between the Americans and the British certainly was an example of a great alliance in world history. But there were far more difficulties than sometimes I think assumed and let on. The big three, Stalin, FDR, and Prime Minister Churchill, you see pictured here, met in person for the first time, I mean at least all three of them together for the first time, to coordinate the war plans. And Stalin, of course, continued to demand a second front, more than anything else on his mind. And he actually threw his weight behind the American strategy, not the British, which shouldn't have been surprising. It actually did sort of surprise George C. Marshall, but I'm not sure why. As Gerhard Weinberg says in another great book on the war, the insistence of Churchill on repeatedly returning to the charge on extended operations in the Mediterranean and delays in Overlord, the code name for the cross-channel invasion, which became known as D-Day later on, meant that most of 3 of the 4 days at the Tehran conference taken up with arguments over strategy. Stalin now insisted that all be subordinated to Overlord. A Soviet offensive would be coordinated with the invasion. Stalin's insistence, in fact, settled the issue, and if it meant that the Soviet Union thereby settled the Anglo-American dispute, one must remember that anyone who asks a question risks receiving an answer. Having put the issue to Stalin in view of their inability to agree, the Western Allies now had his reply. So the author, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, saying about Churchill, he brought it up. He asked Stalin the question, so he had to be prepared for any answer, and possibly one he didn't like, and that's what he got. But Stalin, who had been getting hammered by the German Wehrmacht for a couple of years now, certainly preferred the idea of a major operation, as D-Day would become, over smaller operations in the Mediterranean here and there, the piecemeal approach of Brooke and the British, kind of like the sort of nickeling and diming the German Wehrmacht and Nazi Germany, which doesn't sound like it would be successful to us today, and I think that's true. So Stalin was right. George C. Marshall was right, I believe, that the big cross-channel invasion was the way to go, and it's exactly what Stalin wanted and felt he needed to take pressure off of his Red Army in the East. So once Eisenhower went in as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, he had a staff composed, as I said before, of American and British generals. These guys actually did work together pretty effectively. Eisenhower is sometimes criticized for his leadership role in this position, though there are plenty of historians that think he did a terrific job. I'm of the latter opinion. I think he's one of the greats as far as military leaders in our history, and he had a incredible pressure on him, and in a sense the fate of the Western democratic world in his hands, freedom kind of in his hands, fighting, trying to defeat Nazi Germany. And one of the things he did extremely well, among others, was deal with the British effectively. Not all the British leaders liked him, but most of them did, political and military. And this was important because though the British were a junior ally, less powerful than the United States, they were still necessary as allies to win the war. So it wouldn't have worked as well if the Americans had sent a general that did what Eisenhower did as Supreme Allied Commander, but treated the British in kind of an arrogant, heavy-handed, high-handed fashion. Eisenhower was great at press conferences in Great Britain, and the general public in Britain tended to love him because he went out of his way to kind of compliment them and sort of make them feel like equals, because he knew that's what needed to be done. But they could have easily appointed somebody who didn't have that kind of panache. The first combined operations with British and American forces together was Operation Torch, the Allied campaign and landings in North Africa, which you can see on the map here. The British had been fighting the Germans in North Africa, further to the east in Tunisia and Libya earlier in the war. Famous one-on-one duel between two generals and their armies, Bernard Montgomery, just mentioned on the British side, and a guy named Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox for his legendary campaign in the deserts of northeast Africa here. Though in the end, the British did defeat Rommel's Africa Corps. Rommel was one of the legendary generals in the war. This operation, Eisenhower's first in command, started off shaky. There were some defeats, some low points, but they eventually did clear all remaining German forces out of North Africa. In the next year come the invasions of Sicily and the mainland of Italy itself, Operations Husky and Avalanche, and this is an example of the British sometimes getting their way over the Americans, even though the Americans, again, were providing more of the troops, doing more of the heavy lifting. But they tended to come to conferences, military conferences, with their allies, and be kind of together in a united front, prepared ahead of time to all kind of stick to the same line of reasoning. The American staff didn't do that, so they were easily kind of divided against each other. A little too late, the Americans sort of realized why they were at a disadvantage in that regard, but not until the British had gotten their way a number of times, one of which was these landings in Italy and Sicily, which Marshall and the Americans weren't as wild about. As the textbook author of a U.S. history textbook that I use says, Allied forces continued to battle against stubborn German defenses in Italy for the remainder of the war, making the Italian campaign the war's deadliest for American infantrymen. One soldier wrote that his buddies died like butchered swine. I believe more Americans died in Italy in World War II than anywhere else. I don't think that's very well known, but the fighting was extremely difficult up the Italian peninsula. Stalin wasn't happy with either of these operations, really. These two were bigger than Operation Torch in North Africa, but still not big enough for Stalin's blood because it wasn't siphoning any German troops away from the Eastern Front. So understandably, Stalin is continually pushing for bigger, more from the Americans and British on their side in the West. Operation Overlord, as it was codenamed, was the cross-channel invasion that was eventually scheduled for 1944. Marshall had wanted to go the year before, but the British had gotten their way. It might have been too early to go in 1943 anyway. They might not have been able to build up as large a force. Remember I said at the first part of this lecture that maybe the most important thing the British did in this whole war was to hold out their independent status, not be conquered by Germany, and then allow themselves to be used as a major platform to stage a cross-channel invasion later in the war. And that's exactly what happens here. The Germans knew it was coming. The Americans and the British couldn't hide that millions of American soldiers are coming across the Atlantic and into Britain, hundreds or thousands of planes, tanks, supplies. They're sometimes training in the southern part of England. The Germans knew what was going on. It was impossible to hide. What the Germans didn't know was exactly when and where in France. And on the map, on the upper left, you can see in the red, that's occupied France, sort of the positioning of German units. it was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who was put in charge by Hitler of preparing defenses and trying to figure out how to defend the beaches and how to spread his troops out sort of accordingly. What you kind of have to do in these situations, since you don't know where the attack is coming, is have some troops covering every possible landing zone, but then keep some units in the rear so they can advance in a number of different directions, depending on where the invasion comes. But Rommel was of the insistent belief, not everybody agreed with him on the German side, that the Americans and British had to be stopped at the beaches. That once they got a foothold, a toehold on French territory, it was going to be difficult, if not impossible. So they had to be driven back into the sea, and the first invasion on the first day had to be repulsed, or Rommel thought they were going to lose. So it was his task to try to prepare defenses to make that happen. Just the logistics of preparation for Overlord are staggering. 1,900,000 tons of supplies coming to Britain in just May 1944 alone, the month before the invasion. But that had been happening for months and months on end. So titanic scale of logistics to prepare for D-Day. Eisenhower, as it was said, turned Britain into one gigantic airbase, workshop, storage depot, and mobilization camp, which was certainly true. So this always interests me for some reason, but just again the logistics and the numbers behind just this massive invasion, everything that had to go into this, the numbers are staggering. Rommel here preparing what came to be known as the Atlantic Wall, the defense system that he did put in place, and trying to figure out where the invasion was going to come from and how he would defend. Again, convinced that they needed to be stopped on the beaches, that if they didn't repulse the invasion within the first 24 hours, all would probably be lost. So this is, Rommel made this phrase famous. He called the first day of the battle, before it happened, he said it would be the longest day. In the 1970s, there was a movie about D-Day called The Longest Day, and that phrase has been around ever since. But it was coined by Field Marshal Rommel, who you see pictured here on the right side.